So I welcome everybody to the finals of the national tournament, the English ones. So you know the drill. The first and the last minute of your 7 minutes of protected time, we will be timing you in the chat. I can do it, or if one of my fellow judges wants to do it, that's also an option. No? Okay, I'll be doing it then. The motion that we're going to be debating is this House regrets democracy being understood as the only legitimate form of governance. We have two teams. The first one is from Bežigrad yellow and the other one is Litija A. Now, does anybody have any questions before we begin? No? Okay, who will be the first speaker?
Naya.
Naya, okay. In this case, I kindly invite the first speaker from the side of proposition from the Bežigrad team, Naya, to begin the debate. Hear, hear.
Thank you. I prefer verbal POIs. Democracy being seen as the only legitimate system of governance means that you disabled countries from adjusting systems of governance to their respective situations and create far worse outcomes for individuals and the countries. Three things I'll do in my speech. First, I'll frame the debate. Then I'll talk about how other political systems are disabled because of the narrative. And lastly, about how the narrative forces democracies even when not appropriate. David in second will talk about how the narrative legitimizes unfair treatment of undemocratic countries. First, I'll go through 3 points of framing. One, what does this narrative look like? The narrative presents democracy as the only form of governance that should exist and is good for the people. But note that this primarily focuses on the idea of the parliamentary systems and representative democracies where people elect representatives that are in power for set terms. This is the type of democracy that's mostly present in the Western countries, especially in the US, that heavily skewed our modern understanding of democracy by historically using the narrative to justify its actions and therefore shaped the democracy by forcing it into their country. Two, how is this narrative manifested in the real world? It translates into non-democratic regimes like China being punished heavily, criticized in the media, yet the democratic regimes being rewarded simply because they're called democracy and follow some basic principles. And three, on our stance, we also believe that the narrative that makes people believe democracy is always good and is the only good option is bad, because democracy can be bad in certain situations. It can be flawed in and out of itself, and it can justify bad practices towards non-democratic countries. With that in mind, on to our first argument as to why the narrative disables the political systems from developing in other ways. They're disabled in two ways. Firstly, because of outside factors forcing countries to become democratic. This looks like the IMF aid being conditioned with having democratic principles, or simply with the general belief that democracy is the only right form that should exist. Secondly, because the people want to express their opinion through political means, and democracy makes them believe that their opinion matters in any given situation. Hence, with the existence of the narrative, countries that are democratic are always going to stay democratic and keep all of their democratic practices. This is bad for 3 reasons. One, democracy gives power to the people and makes them feel entitled to their opinion, which is not always good. There are simply situations where the opinion of the people should not be that important, and when the right to freedom of speech should be limited. Go ahead.
What's your alternative to democracy on your side?
We'll talk about that later on in my speech. I'd like to continue as to why it's bad that democracy is being pushed always. There's a number of reasons as to why people might not be able to make good choices. They could simply not have access to knowledge because of barriers of money and time, or people simply not being interested in topic, hence they do not research things like vaccines in detail, and mandatory vaccination therefore has no way of passing. Or B, people prioritize short-term benefits, such as having a job and having a stable income, over the long-term harms, such as, no thank you, climate change, that is posing a larger threat to the humanity. This is when the existence of the narrative is harmful, because it doesn't allow, for example, like a technocracy, where experts are deciding to form and would be able to actually consider wider implications, not only short-term implications for one specific person. And two, no thank you. Decisions are always going to be met with opposition, because there are always going to be people that won't be agreeing with policies. Democracies makes those people feel like they have the right to disagree even with good policies, because like that is one of the fundamental values of democracy. Freedom of speech, hence people will always question and protest decisions that they even slightly disagree with. This is why you get people opposing things like masks and vaccine mandates, even though it would definitely make the pandemic end sooner and therefore would be good. Also, the narrative of democracy being the only legitimate form convinces people that their opinion is right, but without the narrative, the idea could be challenged. Hence, in certain situations, decisions could be implemented even more efficiently, which is crucial in times of crisis. And three, democracy disables long-term planning due to the election circle. Since democracies have limited terms after which another person is going to power, and that next person is very likely to hold somewhat different beliefs. Therefore, in democratic regimes, you cannot rely on implementing long programs such as economic plans, because you simply don't know who the person taking office after you is going to be. On the contrary, in dictatorships, long-term planning is possible because one person has a guaranteed seat in power and can therefore make economic plans. For example, what Xi Jinping is currently doing in China. What did this argument prove? That in certain instances, democracy is simply not the best option for the current currently democratic countries. On to our second argument as to why the narrative forces democracies even in situations when it's simply not appropriate. How does it force it? Simply by relying on the fact that it's the only legitimate form, hence the only one that should exist. People and governments are sometimes likely to buy into this narrative. And what are some instances of this being inappropriate due to barriers for the implementation existing? One, when the population is not educated or when there is a huge buy-in into the non-democratic system, and therefore democracy is not likely to have support, which can and will result in bad decisions, low voter turnouts that make systems weak and unrepresentative. Two, when the stability of the economy is crucial for the development of the country and the country relies on long plans, and the push for democracy will simply worsen that, as I have proven before. And three, when the military is powerful, thus able to simply stage coups and take over control. In situations like that, a narrative that forces citizens to push for democracies has bad implications for the country, because firstly, the country becomes less functioning because the political system is simply weak, and democratic process will be poorly implemented. For example, like what's going on, like the hard election process in Uganda. A tough political system also leads to many changes at the top, which will make policies more likely to be switched, which means that people on the ground are unlikely to ever reap the benefits of the policies. And secondly, a period of instability and struggle for power is likely, which, because of a weak system, allows for military coups or crackdowns of protesters backing the idea of democracy, which has just recently happened in Sudan and Myanmar. So democracy delegitimizes other choices of the people and pushes them to believe that this is the only good option, even though one, they could legitimately support other regimes, and two, the situation in the country is very likely not just yet ready for the democratic push. Because we do not want people dying on the streets in the fight for democracy when the military coup is bound to happen. You vote side proposition. Thank you.
Here. Okay. I thank the first speaker on the side of proposition for this fine speech. And I invite the first speaker on the side of opposition, while also reminding you that please do take POIs.
I would prefer vocal POIs because I'll be looking at Google Docs. And I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The key mistake side of proposition makes is that their case is completely uncomparative, right? We already asked them in a POI what are the alternatives to democracy on their side of the house, and yet they never actually provided us clearly what are the alternatives. When it's better for them, they use the idea of autocratic regimes. When it's better for them, they use the idea of technocracies. We're not sure why is each of them actually likely to happen, and we, on our side, we actually believe the autocratic regimes are more likely to happen because we do not see any technocracies right now in the status quo. They never provided provided us the reasons why our technocracy is likely to exist on their side of the house. How do we win this? But firstly, how do we win this debate on A.D.A.P.T, right? Firstly, by proving that this narrative is true, so that democracy actually is the only legitimate form of governance and best possible system, because the narrative that is true shouldn't be regretted. But then secondly, also by proving that we get more and better democracies on our side of the house, which are in the end beneficial for the people. Before moving on to my argument about why democracy is the only legitimate form of governance, principally and practically, I would like to look at their case, right? Besides having no alternative and having completely uncomparative case, they also forget to tell us what legitimacy actually is, right? We believe that legitimacy is something that is like widely accepted by the majority of people, something that we all consider as good, and this can only happen in a democracy, because only in democracy majority of people can say, yes, we agree to certain policies being passed, we agree to the government being doing certain policies, and so on. So the only legitimate form of governance is democracy, further explained in my argument. But firstly, in their first argument, they talk to us about how democracy might not be like the best case for every scenario. We agree to that, but we need to have comparative in order for us to judge this, right? No, thank you. We can't just say that democracy is bad, but then like in some case, but not actually provide us the alternative. Because even if people are like don't have enough knowledge in order for them to make like good decisions, we believe that on a comparative, people still have more knowledge about what they want and what they need in accordance to their situation than a random autocratic leader that does not have like the best interest of the people at heart, right? This is the comparative they have to take in this debate, because the majority of cases that are not democracies are simply autocratic regimes in the status quo. Then secondly, they talk to us about how democracies enable us like long-term solutions, such as like solving climate change and so on. But note that even if we only have short-term solutions on our side of the house, they fail to prove to us why do randomly selected like autocratic leaders have the incentive to benefit the people, to benefit the climate change. No, thank you, because they can simply like manipulate the people. They can use the repressive organs of the state in order to shut the people down when they're trying to achieve something good for themselves, when they try to fight for climate change. In democracies, people at least have the ability to protest. They have the ability to force the politicians to at least do something if they want to be re-elected. They can talk about it in media. On the comparative, like if you protest in China, you simply get like you simply go to prison. Before moving on, I can take a POI.
What allows people to consent to the democratic regime?
This will be further explained in my first layer, talking about how like democracy is actually the only legitimate form of governance on a principle level. But then secondly, they talk to us about, so they fail to provide to us the clear incentive of like the authoritarian leaders to actually do good for the people. Also note that we are not quite sure how is this linked to the narrative at the point at which they only tell us that democracy is not best in all cases. Then in their second argument, they talked about how it is not okay if like how democracy makes the countries unstable and so on. But note that like and how then this can enable like economic underdevelopment and military coups. Firstly, they are actually okay with military coups on their side of the house because they support autocratic regimes that military coups will actually foster. But then secondly, we're able to have better economic development in the terms of democracy because different people, different parties are able to talk about which is the best possible solution for our economy. On their side of the house, autocratic leaders choose one solution that might not be the best. No, this is extremely important in cases of developing countries that do not have a lot of money and they do not have money to waste on like useless projects, which is less likely to happen on democracies when they actually talk about which is the best possible solution for a certain problem. Because of all of these reasons, we actually get more benefits for the people, but further more explained in my argument. Now moving on to the argument, how like democracy is actually best possible system, principally and practically. Firstly, principally, right? Why is democracy actually legitimate? Firstly, because individuals should have the ability to control their lives, right? In order for you to feel as a proper human being, you have to have the ability to control your life, and this can only happen via democracy, via you selecting your representatives, via you going to referendums, expressing your wills, and so on, and being able to control your future. In the cases of autocracy or technocracy, other people are controlling your life. You do not have the broad bodily autonomy to do what's actually the best for you. Secondly, due to the social contract, right? Because people give up some of their rights, some of their money for example, in the form of taxes to the state, and exactly because this is their own hard-earned money, they should have the ability to decide what is happening with this money. Again, only possible in democracies when people have a say how the tax money is actually spent via elections and so on. And then thirdly, also we're able to have more equality at the point at which every single individual is perceived as having the right to go out and vote, to go out and be able to control their future. no thank you. But then secondly, how democracy is better practically, right? How it fosters better decisions for the people on the ground. Two reasons. Firstly, because people know themselves best what is like best for them, right? Because you as an individual are the only person that knows your past, your like present and your future. You're the only person that knows what are you planning to do in the future, what's your current situation, like medical situation, school situation, meaning that you're the only one that can make best decisions for yourself at the point at which we're talking about different policies. Because even if you don't know best and you might not have all the knowledge possible, on a comparative, autocratic regime is not much better, right? Because you have another person that does not have your best interest in mind actually making decisions instead of you. Note that this person probably also has selfish interest, right? And they want to keep the power, they want to gain as much money as possible, meaning that they're likely to make decisions that are not benefiting the people the most. We also believe that people should be the ones like choosing the values represented in the policies being made, such as, for example, prioritizing healthcare and like schooling instead of like economy and so on. People should have the ability to decide that no one else knows better what people actually want than the people themselves. But secondly, importantly, also note that democracies uniquely have systems of checks and balances, right? Firstly, you have different parties that call each other out because they want to get as much votes as possible, meaning that when another party does something wrong, the other party will call them out, less likely to have corruptions, more likely that the politicians will actually fulfill their campaign promises, meaning that we actually have these best decisions made actually put into practice. Secondly, also note we have like 3 branches of power that are also able to control the government. The courts are able to control the government, so there's way less corruption benefit happening. There are more benefits on the ground because the money is spent in correct ways, and the decisions and the wills, the needs of the people are represented and put into practice. Thus, uniquely at the point at which we have democracies so proud to oppose.
I thank the first speaker on the side of opposition, Marsha, for this fine speech, and I invite the second speaker on the side of proposition. Here.
Just to confirm, I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. I'd like to ask the team in opposition to offer POIs verbally, and with that in mind, my speech will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, situations in countries are different. As such, the system of governance must be tailored to the specific situation that is happening at the moment, rather than to the arbitrary determinants that democracy is the best in 100% of the cases. Notice, this is also something that answers opposition's demand for us to provide to you a clear alternative. We do not need to do so, as what we believe is that the system of governance changes depending on the situation. That is to say, technocracies, autocracies, and other possible regimes of governments will emerge insofar as you don't assert that democracy is the only thing that can legitimacy exist in the world. As such, countries are going to be free to choose on which system of governance should exist in the status quo. That is to say, we don't entirely oppose democracy in its idea. We're simply stating that in certain situations, democracies are not the perfect solutions, and either dictatorship, technocracies, or other possible measures of governance is what has to exist in the country for it to be able to progress the most. A few quick things in my speech. Firstly, rebuttal as to what a second proposition brings to the debate. Then I want to go over a few quick points of reconstruction as to what we bring to you in our arguments. And then last, our third constructive argument, talking about how this narrative legitimizes unfair treatment of countries that are in the status quo under regimes. No, thank you. I want to have a quick few points of rebuttal, but before that, 2 clarifications. One, which I already did on the likely alternatives. Secondly, as to why dictators and other autocratic/theocratic leaders do in fact have the best interests of the people in mind. I think there's a few things that you have to recognize here. A, these people generally want the success of their country because even in the instances where they're really, really selfish people, the success of the country is likely to guarantee the success of this person as an individual, both in regards to the influence they have on the global scale and the amount of money that they by extension are able to get, the amount of power and influence they can receive. Moreover, even in the case of dictatorships, you do need some level of public support. That is to say, you don't want revolutions. That is to say, you don't want sparks of protest and so on and so forth, purely on the basis that that's going to make your country far less effective and functioning. I think you have to recognize dictators aren't the ultimate bad in a vast majority of cases. That is to say, Singapore had a fairly effective autocratic leadership in regards to its development. Same with China, same with multiple other Middle Eastern countries. I think you have to recognize that even if dictators are to an extent not so much accountable as democratic leaders, they do in a lot of the cases have the best interests of the people in mind. A few good points of negation on what opposition brings to the table in the debate. The first argument talk about how democracy is factually the only legitimate system and why this is really, really important. Our responses to that are twofold. One, they just assert that legitimacy comes from certain values that exist with this narrative. That is to say, we tell you that legitimacy can stem from other things. That is the historical background of the leader. That is the people supporting the leader, which happens in a large proportion of dictatorships. That is to say, China. That is to say, a large amount of people support the leader. That is to say, the leader there is perfectly legitimate in the governance that the leader does, purely on the basis of having the people support, purely on the basis of historical progress, purely on the basis of actually wanting to do the best for people.
POI.
It is foolish from opposition to assert that there are only certain levels to what legitimacy means. Before I move on, I can take a POI.
How are you actually going to like make sure that the political system is actually occurring to the like situation at the point in which you do not have democracy? If you have an autocratic regime, it's likely to stay that way, even if democracy or technocracy is likely to be better.
I think because people on the ground are able to understand the situation, as you yourself claim for your analysis to stand, that is to say they're likely to push for a regime of governance that best suits them at that very moment. That is to say, it's a really, really similar analysis to what you provide as best economic and other policy, but we simply choose that with system of governance, further expanding the horizons that people are able to go to in order to create the perfect country for themselves to live in. Furthermore, responses to their principle. Panel, even if they prove to you that this narrative is potentially correct, if you want to define legitimacy as what opposition defines it as, insofar as we prove to you that this narrative causes practical harms to nations, insofar as it causes less development, because you have to force in systems of democracy, this is something we can regret, even if the narrative can potentially be something that is true. Second argument from their side of the House, how you make better decisions. Panel, I think this argument was already implicitly engaged with by Nea's arguments. Why? What does she tell you in first proposition? She explains to you how under democracies, because of election cycles, all of the policies are likely to be short-termist. That is to say, all these systems of checks and balances, all the systems of re-election and so on and so forth, are really, really likely to guarantee a short-termist system where you're unable to opt for long-term economic policy. This is really important specifically in the instance of developing nations. The best response opposition provides to us is that you're risking a lot because you have useless projects. Panel, the same applies in democracies as far as people can be easily manipulated and people are short-termist and they want immediate change rather than structural long-term progressing. I think at best for their side of the House, it's symmetric in democracies with the difference that we're able to have long-term like structural development, which is something that China is crucially doing in the status quo, which led it to become a global superpower. A few more quick points of rebuttal on the points that they bring there. They tell you that people know themselves best. Panel, although it is true that people may understand their situation in the status quo, we also fulfill that principle, A, because we allow the people to choose in between different regimes of governance, that is, say, through other metrics, not limiting them to a democratic system. But moreover, people oftentimes do understand themselves, but not the broader picture. That is to say, the harmful decisions from the side of the people are likely to happen because they're unable to grasp the whole scope of things. That is, prioritizing, say, the healthcare system's development, when in reality, the country needs other steps of development in order to be able to develop the system of healthcare because the country is like in crippling debt. I think this is crucially something that people cannot have on their side of the House and something that is better in technocracies and authoritarian regimes. Third constructive, how this narrative legitimizes unfair treatment of undemocratic countries. Panel, look, it is really, really important that you have to, look, regardless, okay, doesn't matter. Why do you legitimize unfair treatment of undemocratic countries? How is this narrative manifested? That is to say, why do you legitimize this unfair treatment? Look, insofar as this narrative exists, insofar as you assume that democracy is the factually sole legitimate system of governance, you're unlikely to support other systems. You're unlikely to acknowledge their existence as something that is valid and has place within the status quo. From that, it manifests in different degrees of severity. Firstly, you have direct military interventionism, and this is the most extreme form of it. This is directly harmful to the people on the ground. However, moreover, it looks in things such as sanctions that limit the ability of alternate system of governance to function. That is to say, USA sanctions on Cuba limited Cuba's ability to function as a country, further harming the people within there. I think you have to realize that this crucially happens purely because this narrative allows these countries to legitimize this and further tells the people on the ground in these countries to do so. And this brings me to my next point of manifestation, that is for direct discrimination. It is oftentimes seen that the narrative around countries such as China and other autocratic regimes within the West is really, really problematic. Why? Purely on the basis that people think that democracy is the only valid thing, thus by default discriminate against these countries and their regimes. What does this mean? This means that even if these regimes could be functional, they're limited in this regard, and the people on the ground are harmed by this narrative more than they are benefited, also because of the analysis that Nea brings to you as how the democracy that is being forced is really, really bad. So why do you give this debate to proposition? Firstly, because we proved to you how democracy isn't ideal in all situations, and system of governance must vary depending on the current situation within the country. Secondly, because we proved to you how forcing a system of democracy is likely to result in bad things for people on the ground. And lastly, how this narrative legitimizes discrimination against these countries and further harm to people. Proud to propose.
I thank David for this fine speech, and I invite the second speaker on the side of opposition. You're here.
I will be taking my POIs verbally.
Okay, just a moment. You're a bit quiet.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, no, it's better. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'm the second speaker of opposition, and we believe that democracy should be seen as the only legitimate form of government. And now I'll be negating the previous speaker's comments. So how will people be able to decide in an authoritarian regime? Because a leader only cares about himself. And a leader decides everything just for them, and that is the only reason they do things. And if a leader and they don't have the leader often doesn't have the best interest for the people, because the only thing that they care about is their own interest and their own power. And in authoritarian regimes, there's also a lot of state media which portray the country as good, even if it isn't, even if it has problems, and they only point out the good things that are happening in the country, but there is no criticism of the bad things happening. And people in autocratic regimes often don't necessarily like their leader, and they don't fight back just because they're scared of them, because if they do fight back, they will be punished. But in democracies, people can protest, fight for their rights, and in authoritarian regimes, they're arrested, beaten, to make sure they won't step up again. And also, leaders in democratic regimes have to actually be good because they want to get re-elected, because if they didn't make good decisions, people wouldn't re-elect them again, because they saw that this leader was doing poorly and they wanted another leader who was more capable. And he also said that democracies often do things just for their own interest. For example, oil. So if a country has other interests, they will do it either way and not because a country is democratic. Yeah.
Recognize that such a narrative grants these countries a lot of legitimacy that crucially increases the amount of interventions that happens. Furthermore, it gives them reason to impose things such as sanctions on undemocratic regimes.
Okay, I'll be talking about that later, but also, in my argument, I'll be talking about firstly why spreading democracy is good, and then secondly, the benefits that people get with democracy. So yeah, how people could get more in democracy. So as democracy spreads, people will want to gain rights because they will realize their previous position wasn't good. They will realize that their working conditions weren't good, and they will protest, fight back. There could be civil wars, uprisings. And when there's a narrative that democracy is the best form of government, people themselves will want democracy and will want to fight for it, to get out of the oppressive authoritarian regime. And also, other countries will support these new countries to become democracies. And so developed countries will send financial support so they could establish democracy. For example, USAID improves national and local governments. And democracies, there are also way more NGOs which will help these democracies, because NGOs help decide democracies work properly, and they do this by making it easier for people to get information about how their country is being run, helping the public communicate with politicians, and making sure that the governments do not abuse their power, which a lot of the times happens in more authoritarian regimes. So as I said before, if politicians want to get re-elected, they will have to do a lot for it, because there are a ton of possible candidates that want the same job, and if they don't do their best, other candidates will be elected in their place. And they have to convince people why they are the best, not just because the position is inherited, which happens a lot of times in autocratic systems. And that's why candidates make better decisions, and there are more parties, more options, and more perspectives on different topics. So my second argument is about what benefits people get with democracy. So with spreading democracy attributes strongly to economic development, and supporting democracy promotes better worker conditions, so less exploitation, and then allows religious freedom and self-expression and less censorship. Democracy is also lower in inflation, lower political instability, and then higher economic freedom and higher education levels. So people in democracies are oftentimes way more educated to be able to participate in the government. Thank you. That is all for my speech.
Okay, I thank Litija for this fine speech, and I invite the third speaker on the side of proposition to continue the debate. However, if you want a minute to structure your thoughts, you are free to do so.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
I would prefer verbal POIs from the side of opposition, if that is possible. Let me just set my timer. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Democracy forces the countries that are not yet ready to become democratic to be democratic and to deal with all the consequences that are then imposed to them. It also forces the countries that are currently democratic to stay democratic and to not adapt to a situation where it's crucially needed to adapt, where we need long-term planning, when we need better decision made by people that actually know the situation. This is why we win this debate, and this is what I'll show you throughout my third speech and through 3 clashes. Firstly, should we force the idea of democracy and make more countries democratic? Secondly, is democracy actually more principally just than all of the other systems? And thirdly, is it actually good on the practical level for democracies to always be democratic? Firstly, then, should we force the idea of democracy? This clash is winning us the debate because at the point at which we showed you that this narrative is harmful to all of the countries that are not democratic and is putting them through so much struggle, this means a lot of suffering for a lot of people in a lot of different countries. What does opposition tell you here? It tells you that more countries should be democratic because democracy is simply something that is good. I'll prove to you that democracy is not always good in all of the other clashes. Here I'll just show to you that it's bad to force democracy in those specific situations. Why is it bad? There are 2 things we tell you here. Firstly, we tell you that it should not be forced by the people that are simply convinced that democracy is good by a simple narrative that legitimizes democracy and makes it seem as the only good thing, because it leads to a lot of bad consequences. In short, we tell you that democracy should only form when the situation is appropriate from it. What are the examples of inappropriate situation? It means that you have a strong military that is likely going to take over or crack down on everyone supporting the democracies. This means in Sudan, for example, when you had military literally shooting up the protesters. Or secondly, in situations where economic stability is really important and changing the entire system, making the politicians change all the time is going to significantly weaken your country, lead to a lot of power vacuums and a lot of fighting inside a country. Thirdly, it can be when people simply oppose the idea of democracy or are already so convinced that a dictatorship regime is something that is so beneficial for them and are not going to vote and are not going to legitimize the actual system. This is when the narrative is bad, because people believe that democracy should only be the one that they have to fight for, and democracy should be the only system. Fighting for it, firstly, it destabilizes the country. It makes it politically unfunctional, politically weak, which means that it also leads to a lot of social changes, a lot of bad things in economic levels. But secondly, it also means that people are going to be dying in the fight for democracy because military is going to be shooting them up on the street. The best response we got from proposition is that we then support military coups. I don't think that this is true because at the point at which you have a stable dictatorship rather than a weak democracy, you're not going to get a military coup that is actively going to be oppressing huge amounts of people. The second thing we tell you why forcing democracies is bad is that democracy should not be forced from the outside factors because it leads to a lot of complications and suffering of the people. This is when David's argument crucially comes to place. He tells you that there are certain countries that are using the idea of democracy to treat non-democratic countries very, very badly. He tells you that they use it for example, interventionism. In the example of USA in Latin America, he tells you that they use it for conditioning aid. That means that certain countries are simply not going to get aid until they become democratic. They use it for sanctioning different countries. They also use it simply for discrimination on the global level, for trashing them in the media and things like that. This is very bad for the country because they're going to suffer either economically, or people on the ground are literally not going to get enough food to eat. They're going to be stuck in poverty and things like that. This is when forcing the idea of democracy is very bad for huge amounts of countries, and this is why we're already winning this debate. But before I show you why democracy is bad in and of itself, yes to the POI.
Note that at the point at which America has such large amounts of power and has the interest in gaining like geopolitical power, strategic power, and also like oil, they're likely to do interventions on each side of the house. Nothing actually changes.
Interventions, sure, but they're not going to be able to condition aid with democracy. They're not going to be able to sanction countries with the idea of democracy being in place. Those are things that crucially still exist, and also more countries can intervene at the point at which America is using the idea of democracy as the only possible excuse. Secondly, is democracy more principally just than other countries? We're winning this clash because we take down their first argument and their one line of analysis, like one line at which they can win this debate, which is that they showed you that this narrative is actually true. Firstly, I want to deal with the consent and decision. David already told you that there are other ways to legitimize different decisions and different systems. He tells you that, like, for example, historically, or just simply by performing good economically. Secondly, we tell you that you do not consent to the regime because you never choose to consent to the idea of democracy. At the point at which the narrative would not exist, you would be able to choose the regime more freely because you're able to decide which regime you're going to be ruling it, because you can choose the technocracy, you can choose the dictatorship, you can simply oppose the regime that is currently in place. Thirdly, we tell you that consent is actually flawed even in democracies because you're not consenting to laws, you're not consenting to enforcement, you're simply consenting to politicians that are going to be representing you. You cannot consent to specific laws. This means that there's no more consent in the democracy rather than less consent because the narrative is the only thing that's legitimizing this. Secondly, they tell you about social contract, but we tell you the state anyways provides you protection for you with laws, with passports, with things like that. Why voting specifically would legitimize social contract? Thirdly, they tell you equality, but we tell you this minority vote is not respected anyways, and it matters less than the majority vote. Hence, at the equality, they also fail. This means that democracy in and of itself is not more legitimate than other systems. Lastly, on the practical things, should democracy always be the perfect one? Why did they lose? Because they have a premise that dictators are always bad. This is wrong because one, success of the country is also connected with the success of the dictator. They're going to be getting more money, they're going to be more respected, things like that. Secondly, because they earned the support of the people historically because they were charismatic or things like that, they needed to get in power in one way. Thirdly, because we tell you that in the international relations, they need to be viewed as a respected person, they need to be viewed as a strong leader to actually have trade relations, things like that. Fourthly, because you need a lot of public support, because mind you that only 3% of the population militarizing is already enough to take you down as a dictator. This is why you also need to be responsible to the people. Why do we then crucially tell you that one, you need long-term decisions that democracy can never provide to you. You can never restructure the economy, you can never fight for climate change because those things are going to harm you in the first few years of your government. This means that you're not going to be re-elected because you drown the economy. Secondly, we tell you that we're going to have better decisions because they're not going to be done purely by the people, because even if the people know themselves best, there are structural reasons because people are short-termists, people care more about themselves than other people because they're influenced by populist rhetoric and because they do not have access to education because of certain different barriers that Naya has listed in the first proposition speech, that they cannot make the best decision. Lastly, we also tell you that in non-democracies, there is going to be better enforcement because people are not going to impose every single thing that is imposed upon. This is also why the narrative is bad, because it doesn't allow for all of the other regimes to actually arise in any possible situation where there's situations that are better when the democracies are not existing, and I'm proud to propose.
I thank Anna for this fine speech, and I invite the third speaker on the side of opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, I would prefer my POIs to be vocal, or you can also do them visually, and if I don't see them, you can do it vocally after that. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, we believe that a brittle democracy is always better than a stable technocracy or autocracy or any other alternative that the side of proposition has to offer to you in this debate. Why do we believe so? We believe so rather simply because only in democracies people's will is respected, and only in democracies people can actually choose what they want to fight for and what is actually their main focus in a state that they want to do. Throughout my speech, I'm going to firstly clear some things up and point out some tensions. Then I'm going to go through 3 main clashes. Firstly, on the principle level, secondly, on the development, and thirdly, about the bad regimes. So firstly, let's clear some things up. Throughout their whole speeches, they're trying to propose to you this idea about alternatives and how people will choose which alternative they will want, and how people will choose to actually consent to the regime and that they cannot consent to the democracy. But their panel, the side of proposition, has to realize that people can only consent in democracies when they go to elect somebody, when they go voting, and they actually decide what kind of political party they actually want them leading. People cannot decide if they want the autocratic regime to lead them. Rather simply because autocratic regimes come to power with military coups, with actually being fought for in wars and stuff like that. So we can rather clearly see that consent is far greater in democracies. But furthermore, if they are talking to you about choosing this regime that the people want, they would actually prefer democracy, because only in democracies people can actually choose what kind of regime they want. No, thank you. So they need to clear this up to actually decide, do they want people choosing the system and people choosing what their main focus should be, or do they want this autocratic leader or technocratic leader or whatever. But furthermore, they have to actually show to us why they would have anything other than autocracies, because we can rather simply see that every political system in this society, besides democracies, is mostly autocracies. We don't have any technocracies. They have to explain these alternatives in their next speech. No, thank you. Now moving on to the first clash, talking on the principle level about why people should actually always be able to choose what they want, and why, principally speaking, democracy is the only legitimate option of a political system, and therefore it should not be regretted. Firstly, they're trying to propose to this idea about how people should not be able to choose because they are uneducated and may choose badly, and so on. And we have 4 main responses here. Firstly, we believe that it's far better comparatively on our side of the house. So because people can actually decide what they want money to be given to. People can decide if they prioritize jobs or they prioritize like healthcare and something like that. No, thank you. So people should be the one that actually decide, even if this decision is bad, it will only impact the people. Therefore, they should be the ones deciding what they want to happen in their own state. Secondly, we believe that, as much I already told you about the social contract, people give some rights up in order to actually get something in return. And would they get far more in return on our side of the house when they get stable jobs, just like they can do, autocracies at the side of proposition is trying to tell to you, but they also get the right to choose what they actually want, what their main focus should be, in what political system they want to be driving forward. So we are far better at fulfilling this social contract. Now, thirdly speaking, we believe that this point is rather simply just elitist. We believe that people can still know what they want, even if they are manipulated. People can still, just a second, people can still see like roads being bad or healthcare being bad, and they can decide if they want to better this. So they should be the one deciding what they want to be better at, not the state just telling people what they actually want. I will take your POI.
Recognize that even if people know what they want in a narrow context, in a broader context of the whole country, or like furthermore, the whole world, people are oftentimes not educated enough to be able to make decisions that impact the entire nation.
Rather simply, we believe that people do not need to make decisions that make this broader nation and so on. People should be actually able to come each to their own with their selfish interest. And when you put this together, when you put all these ideas together, you are actually able to create the best society possible. Therefore, democracy is the best. Now, fourthly, here about how people are not educated, we believe that rather simply people are still responsible for their decisions, and therefore they will try doing what is best for them and actually focus on what they believe is the most important thing for the whole society, not only for themselves. Now, moving on to the second point on the principle layer, how this may be bad for the economy, as they are trying to propose to you. And we rather simply believe that people should be the one choosing what they prioritize. If you just look at the COVID example, if people decide to prioritize having more jobs over some lives, they should be able to prioritize that, because people are the ones that give tax money. People are the ones that are actually living in the state, and they should be the ones that actually decide what the focus of the state will be on. now moving on to the second clash, talking about the development. We are mostly talking here about long-term development, and they're trying to sell to you this idea about how dictatorships are much longer term, and therefore they can create long-term consequences and so on. But rather simply, firstly, they have never provided you incentive to actually be good. They're trying to say this idea about how, oh, they don't want to be overthrown. But if we just look at incentives in a democratic system, they have the incentive, firstly, to not be overthrown, and secondly, the incentive to be re-elected. So we can see that the incentive is far greater in a democratic system, therefore we win on this point about incentive. But furthermore, secondly, we believe that it's far better to actually do good short-term stuff than long-term things that don't actually matter, because just wasting money on long-term projects that don't mean anything to people is not okay. This is why democracy should be actually the main goal and the only legitimate system, because only then people can actually decide what they want to spend money on, what the focus of the state should be. But firstly, thirdly, furthermore, we have to realize that in autocratic regimes, in all these regimes where one person is ruling or not all the people, there is much further levels of the repression. So rather simply, these dictators don't actually know what people want, because they just suppress other opinions. They don't actually listen to them and try to create these fresh ideas. And secondly, we believe that if these regimes are doing better on terms of development, it is far more likely to change democratic systems than to change actually these autocratic systems where you have to overthrow them through military and so on. So we believe that we also win on the point of development. But thirdly, on the third clash about better regimes, we firstly believe that democracies are better on our side of the house because we have these NGOs, because we have checks and balances which can be done through each other from states and through people to the state. If we just look at an example like Poland sleeping in an autocratic regime and EU is calling them out, and it's like getting better for minorities because they can call each other out and so on. But furthermore, secondly, on these other regimes that are not democracies, they were trying to propose to this idea. This was their main focus, like military interventions and sanctions. Rather simply, we believe that US always does what they want. US has never been striving toward actually getting better democracies around the globe. They're striving towards getting more power, getting more oil, and so on. So we believe that they would put these sanctions in place, put these military interventions in place. Either way, having this incentive about democracies is simply not realistic, and furthermore, they will always find new values to actually condition these sanctions on. So we believe that this does not change. This is a watch in this debate. So if you believe in all those things, if you believe that people should be actually to choose what they want, and if you believe that people should be able to choose what point of development they want, please vote for the side of opposition.
Okay, I thank Laura for this fine speech, and I invited the fourth speaker on the side of opposition to finish the line of opposition today. You're here.
Okay, I hope I'm audible and everything is fine. Okay, cool. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're still not sure how the side of a proposition actually looks like, right? Because they never explain to us how does this like actually doing the right thing for the situation thing actually happens on their side of the house. Does this mean that they have like people have assemblies every 5 years and decide if they want an autocratic regime, if they want technocracy, or if they want democracy? We're not quite sure how this looks like on their side of the house, but we already ended this debate. Note that overthrowing an authoritarian leader is not as easy as side of proposition is trying to tell you. You cannot just decide one day and like now I want to have democracy and this is done in 5 days, right? This is a long-term process. People have to sacrifice a lot in order to do that, and then we're actually able to like fulfill the people's needs better on our side of the house when we have democracy, when people can actually choose if they want to have like a more technocratic democracy, if they want to have a democracy with like a strong economic intervention of the government. People can choose that on our side of the house and actually do what's best for the situation, but they can actually choose that. On their side of the house, people are stuck with an authoritarian leader and nothing can be actually changed. But firstly, I will go through two clashes. Firstly, on the principle, and secondly, on the decisions and the implementation of these decisions. So how is democracy actually only legitimate? Because they tell us that there are other forms of legitimacy, but they firstly never explain to us how do they define legitimacy on their side of the house, so like the historical ideas actually count. Because note, we believe that like legitimacy is legitimate is something that is widely agreed upon, right? And this can only be, so like the government, the policies can only be legitimate at the point at which majority of people agree on that. And this can only happen in democracy, meaning because because people go out and vote, they go to referendums, and they consent to that to a way greater extent than they do in autocratic regimes. But secondly, also know that people know themselves best, and that they should have the ability to control their lives, and this can only happen in democracies. They never explain to us why on principle level this is better with like technocracies and democracies. The only thing they tell us is about that people simply don't know enough. Firstly, this is elitist, as I already told you, but note we're also talking about values. We're not only talking about best possible solutions, we're talking about if we prefer healthcare or economy and stuff like that. This can be done only by the people and not by the technocrats. But note, majority of cases they have to defend is autocracy, which is like already the status quo. But then also know they tell us that people are selfish, and but at the point at which like you have a lot of selfish people going together, the decisions might in the end will be good for the majority. Also note that autocrats are also likely to be selfish by their characterization of like random people, meaning that they're likely to do what's best for them and not what's best for the people. But now let's look at the decisions, right? How are the decisions made? On our side of the house, we believe that like at the point at which you have an autocracy, the decisions are not likely to be the best because the authoritarian leader has the selfish incentive of staying in power, getting more money. And even if they tell us that like they are afraid of like uprisings and like revolutions and so on, the way easier thing to do is, instead of like actually pleasing the people, is actually like simply using state media to gaslight the people into them believing that their situation is actually okay. Secondly, by simply oppressing them, simply at the point at which one person people are protesting that they don't agree with a certain policy, you can simply put them to jail. And second, meaning that they don't actually have to listen to the people, meaning that they never, or like in a lot of cases, majority of cases, don't make best decisions for the people. Then the implementation of these decisions, which are better on our side of the house, in democracy, they're actually implemented because people want to be re-elected. But also know that short-term benefits are actually good because they will for sure happen. People will for sure have the ability to like actually benefit from this from these benefits. On their side of the house, we don't see what's the incentive of the autocratic leader to actually implement good long-term decisions, even if they have the ability to implement something long-term. But then lastly, let's talk about like non-democratic regimes. Interventions and sanctions will happen either way on both sides of the house, because US simply has firstly enough power to do that irregardless. Even if like 3 countries then say it is not legitimate for you to do that, they can simply do it. We don't quite see how this happens, how this actually changes. US won't simply feel bad because they're illegitimate, and they also have like the other interests are way stronger than being legitimate, such as gaining geopolitical power, such as gaining oil and money and so on. Because of all of these reasons, because we actually benefit the people on the ground, I'm so proud to oppose.
I thank Masha for this fine speech, and I invite the 4th speaker on the side of proposition to finish today's debate. Here.
Okay, making sure I'm audible once again. Okay, cool.
Yes, you are.
My speech begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't know where opposition gets the idea that we oppose democracies in all of its manifestation in 100% of the cases. That is to say that we support democracy not existing. I think we made it very clear from the start. What we support is a system in which democracies exist, but other systems of governance are also perceived as legitimate. That's to say, they're not immediately shut down when they emerge. That is to say, they're not sanctioned to the point of not being able to be functional. That is to say, democracies aren't perceived as the only alternative that people are allowed to support. Notably, we acknowledge that democracy has its benefits in certain regards. Never once have we argued that democracy in 100% of the cases cannot exist as a system of governance. We're simply arguing that such a narrative, A, is more harmful because of its manifestations in the real world in regards to forced democracy, and B, that in certain instances, autocratic and theocratic regimes are more likely to benefit the people, thus they're equally legitimate. There's 3 questions that I want to discuss this debate on in the reply. Firstly, where do you have better policy for people on the ground? This is I think something that both proposition and opposition heavily impact. Secondly, where do you have a system of forced democracy and the manifestations of that, as well as why the narrative is harmful in that regard? Lastly, the question of the principle that I think is slightly more relevant, but still deserves to be discussed. So where do you get better policy for the people on the ground? The line that we get here from opposition is that people know what's best for themselves, and that we're elitist for assuming they're sometimes uneducated and thus cannot make the best decisions. Panel, although the individual, as we previously stated, may know what he wants in the status quo in this very moment, the individual cannot consider the broader picture, the broader perspective. This is a large issue in democracy, specifically because of the short-termist nature of people, election cycles, and politicians. Due to this fact, individuals are oftentimes likely to pick solutions that are really, really ineffective to the problems in the status quo. This looks like democratic countries not being able to tackle COVID pandemics, resulting in longer lockdowns, resulting in more deaths compared to like autocratic regimes such as China that are more effectively effectively able to implement the mechanisms that they have to implement within the status quo, purely because the people do not because in democracies, people are unable to grasp the whole picture of the status quo and are really short-termist and selfish. This doesn't mean that people that are uneducated cannot vote. It simply means that people are really short-termist, in that regard, really uneducated. Moreover, I think you have to recognize the importance of long-term over short-term policy. It is really, really crucial that you're able to make long-term steps towards development, specifically within developing nations, which is crucially where we support autocratic regimes in these instances. That is to say, in countries such as China, in countries such as Singapore, and these are really, really effective methods of progressing within the status quo, really, really effective methods of establishing a system in which you develop really fast through a long-term sustainable plan, which doesn't have to be changed every 4 years. I think this is something really important and according to the situation best for democracy. Lastly, on stability. Panel, you have to recognize that democracies by definition are really, really unstable insofar as it relies on a division within the state. That is to say, stability is really valued in certain situations because the country needs stability in order to be able to progress further and guarantee better life for the people on the ground. I think this question is really important because it proves to you how you have to give debate to proposition purely on the ground of achieving better policy for people depending on the situation. Also notice, the dictators oftentimes do have the best interests of people in mind. That is to say, they want the country to be successful as a bare minimum because that benefits them in themselves. I think we already sufficiently saw this within the real world manifestations. Second argument about enforcing democracy, and this is crucially where opposition does not engage enough. All opposition says is that, but the US would intervene anyways because oil. Panel, look, even if the US would intervene in certain instances because oil, there are far more sanctions being placed on undemocratic countries such as Cuba within the status quo, exactly because of this narrative. Notice, sanctions don't get you oil. Sanctions are only there because you want to sanction this country due to its undemocratic ideals and so on and so forth. I think this is crucially something that only happens in that instance. Moreover, democracy is forced by the people on the ground themselves because they are convinced that this is the only legitimate system. This is the analysis NEA gives you, no response coming from all. Lastly, on the principle, what if opposition told you here? Opposition tells you, but democracy is factually the only legitimate system. First off, this is irrelevant insofar as I've already proven to you why it's really, really harmful. But B, democracy isn't the only legitimate system, as opposition never proves why legitimacy is defined only by things such as majority support. Recognize that insofar as you like the dictatorship, insofar as the dictatorship does best for the people on the ground in the practicals, which you visibly see in countries such as China, it can be equally legitimate to democratic regimes. Panel, you vote for proposition because A, we have better policy for the people, we have a better global environment, and lastly, we're principally consistent. Proud to propose.